Sarah had always been the kind of woman who smiled even when everything inside her was falling apart. She had learned that skill early in life, growing up in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone's business, and showing weakness meant giving people something to talk about for years. She was 32 years old, 5 months pregnant, and standing in front of her bathroom mirror on a Saturday morning, pressing her hand against her round belly and telling herself that today was going to be fine. Today was just another day. Except it was not. Today was the day her ex-husband Daniel was getting married to someone else. The invitation had arrived 6 weeks earlier. A thick cream envelope with gold lettering and her name written in careful calligraphy. At first, she thought it was a mistake. She and Daniel had only been divorced for 14 months. The ink on their papers had barely had time to dry. But the card inside was real, and her name was on it. And there was a handwritten note tucked behind it in Daniel's familiar scratchy handwriting. It said, "I think it would mean a lot to both of us if you came. Let's show everyone we are adults about this." Sarah had read that note 4 times. Then she had set it on her kitchen counter and walked away from it. But she kept coming back to it, the way a person keeps pressing on a bruise just to see if it still hurts. She had not told anyone about the pregnancy yet. Not her mother. Not her best friend Greta. Not even her doctor knew about the full situation at home, because Sarah had transferred to a new clinic after the divorce and kept everything very quiet. The baby's father was not Daniel. That was the part that made everything complicated. The baby belonged to a man named Marcus, a quiet and steady architect she had met 8 months after her divorce was finalized. They had dated for only 3 months before she discovered she was pregnant. Marcus had been kind about it. More than kind. He had sat across from her at a small restaurant when she told him, and he had taken a long breath, and then he had reached across the table and covered her hand with his and said, "Okay, let's figure this out together." Sarah had cried that night, not from sadness, but from the shock of someone responding to hard news with gentleness instead of anger. But Marcus was not in the picture in the way Sarah had hoped. His company had transferred him to Germany for a 2-year contract 3 months ago. They were still in contact. They were still figuring things out across 7 time zones and bad phone connections. It was not simple. Nothing about Sarah's life at that moment was simple. She had decided to attend Daniel's wedding for one reason only, and it was not the reason Daniel assumed. She did not go because she wanted to show she was mature. She did not go because she wished him well, though she did, somewhere deep and honest inside herself. She went because she had heard through mutual friends that Daniel had been telling people a very specific version of their divorce. In his version, Sarah had been cold and distant and difficult. In his version, he was the one who had tried to save the marriage, and she was the one who had walked away. She had heard this story repeated back to her by 3 different people in 3 different conversations, and each time it had made something tighten in her chest. She knew the real story. She knew about the 2 years of quiet loneliness inside that marriage. She knew about the counselor they had seen for 6 months, the one Daniel had stopped going to after the 4th session without telling Sarah, who kept going alone for 2 more months before realizing she was sitting in that office by herself every week talking about a marriage that only she was trying to fix. She knew about the night she had sat on the edge of their bed and told Daniel she was exhausted and needed him to meet her halfway, and he had looked at her with blank eyes and said he did not know what she wanted from him. She had told him, plainly, and without drama. He still had not understood, or had not wanted to. The wedding was held at a vineyard about 40 minutes outside the city. The venue was genuinely beautiful. Long rows of grapevines stretched toward a pale sky, and white chairs were arranged on a green lawn, and everything smelled like cut grass and early autumn. Sarah arrived in a dark blue dress that she had bought specifically because it was elegant but not showy, and because the loose cut around her middle meant her pregnancy was not immediately obvious. She had thought carefully about that. She was not hiding the baby. She simply was not ready for that conversation to happen in the middle of someone else's wedding. Greta had offered to come with her, but Sarah had said no. She wanted to walk in alone. She wanted to be seen walking in alone and looking completely fine, because she was completely fine, or she was getting there. She found her seat near the back, which was where she had hoped to sit. A few people she recognized from her years with Daniel gave her small surprised looks when they saw her. One woman, a cousin of Daniel's named Patrice, came over immediately and hugged her and whispered, "I think it's really brave that you're here," in a tone that suggested she thought it was actually insane. Sarah smiled and said she was happy for Daniel and minted enough that it did not feel like a complete lie. Daniel saw her about 20 minutes before the ceremony began. He was standing near the entrance to the vineyard's main building, dressed in a pale gray suit, looking tanned and confident in the way men sometimes look when they are entering a new chapter and feeling good about it. When his eyes found her, something shifted in his expression. It was fast, gone in less than a second. But Sarah had been married to this man for 6 years, and she knew his face the way she knew her own handwriting. What she saw in that moment was not surprise. It was something closer to satisfaction. He had expected her to come. He had wanted her to come. He walked over. She stood up from her seat, and they shook hands the way people do when they have once shared a bed and a bank account and a last name, and have since reduced all of that to something that fits inside a handshake. "You look good," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Congratulations. I'm glad you made it." He glanced at her midsection for just a fraction of a second. It was so quick that someone watching from a distance would not have caught it. But Sarah caught it. He had heard something. She did not know from who, but he had heard something, and he was looking at her with that expression she remembered from arguments in their kitchen, the one that meant he believed he held an advantage. "I wouldn't have missed it," she said, and smiled, and turned back to her seat. The ceremony was lovely. The bride, a woman named Claire who worked in marketing and had straight blonde hair and a wide-open smile, looked genuinely happy. Sarah watched her walk down the aisle and felt something uncomplicated and real. She was glad Daniel had found someone. She was glad Claire looked happy. She hoped it lasted. What happened at the reception was different. What happened at the reception was the thing Sarah had not fully prepared herself for. Though somewhere in the back of her mind, she had known something was coming. She had felt it in the way Daniel had looked at her. She had felt it in the way a few of his friends had spoken to her during cocktail hour with careful, loaded smiles. She had felt it the way you feel weather changing before the sky shows you what it is becoming. The reception hall was warm and lit with soft gold lights. Tables were arranged around a wooden dance floor. There were flowers everywhere, white and cream and pale green, and the whole room smelled like roses and candle wax. Sarah sat at a table near the side with two people she did not know well, a colleague of Daniel's and his wife, who were pleasant and easy to talk to. She drank sparkling water and ate the salad course and began to think that maybe she had been wrong. Maybe nothing was going to happen. Maybe she could finish her meal, say a quiet goodbye, and drive home and put this entire day behind her. Then Daniel picked up a microphone. The room settled into a gentle quiet when Daniel tapped the side of his champagne glass and lifted the microphone. It was not unusual for a groom to speak at his own reception. It was expected, even. People around the room turned in their chairs and held their glasses and smiled with the relaxed warmth of guests who had eaten well and drunk enough and were feeling generous toward the world. Sarah set down her fork and folded her hands in her lap and told herself to breathe steadily. Daniel began with the standard things. He thanked the guests for coming. He talked about the vineyard, how he and Claire had found it on a trip they took together 2 years ago and had immediately known they wanted to get married there. He said something funny about the weather that morning and people laughed. He looked at Claire with real warmth, and Claire looked back at him the same way. And for a few minutes Sarah genuinely relaxed. She looked around the room at the candlelit faces and the flowers and the soft gold light falling over everything and thought, "This is fine. This is just a wedding." She could leave in another hour, and this would all be behind her. Then Daniel paused. He looked down at the microphone in his hand for a moment, the way a person does when they are building towards something. Then he looked back up, and his gaze traveled across the room, and it landed on Sarah. Not near her. On her. Directly, and without accident. "I also want to say something a little personal," he said. His voice was still warm, still measured. "Because I think honesty is important on a day like today. And because there are some people in this room who were part of an earlier chapter of my life." He smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that looks open while actually closing a door. "Some of you know that I was married before. And I invited my ex-wife here today because I believe in moving forward without bitterness." He paused again. "I hope she can say the same." The room went very still. Not a dramatic stillness. Not the kind you see in movies where a glass drops or a chair scrapes. Just a soft, careful stillness. The kind that happens when a group of people collectively realize they are witnessing something that was not on the program. Sarah felt every pair of eyes in the room move toward her. She felt them the way you feel a shift in temperature. She kept her face calm. She had spent years learning how to keep her face calm. Daniel continued. His voice had taken on a slightly different quality now, something that sounded like sincerity, but moved like a carefully aimed thing. I know our divorce was hard. I know people had a lot of opinions about what happened and why. And I know that life moves on in unexpected ways for all of us. Another pause. I heard some news recently about Sarah, and I just want to say, publicly, that I wish her well with whatever comes next for her. He raised his glass. A few people around the room raised theirs, uncertainly, not fully understanding what they were drinking to. Some people were still looking at Sarah. Some people were looking at Daniel with the kind of expression that wondered what exactly they had just heard. Claire, sitting at the head table, had a smile fixed on her face, but her eyes were slightly too wide, as if the speech had taken a turn she had not been fully briefed on. What Daniel had done was elegant in a cruel way. He had not said anything outright. He had not announced anything or accused anyone of anything. He had simply pointed a spotlight at Sarah, in a room full of people who knew their history, and implied that she was carrying a secret, and wished her well with it in a tone that made wishing her well sound like something else entirely. He had made her the subject of the room's attention without technically doing anything she could object to. It was the same move he used to make in arguments, the one she had never quite learned to counter in the moment, where he would say something cutting and then stand back and look hurt when she reacted to it. Sarah sat very still for exactly 4 seconds. She counted them in her head the way her old therapist had taught her. For seconds before responding to anything that makes your chest tighten. For seconds to let the first reaction pass through without acting on it. On the 5th second, she stood up. She did not do it dramatically. She did not push back her chair with force or make a sound. She simply rose from her seat the way a person does when they have decided something. She picked up her own glass, which held sparkling water, and she looked at Daniel across the room, and she smiled. Not the tight smile she had been using all evening. A different one, quieter and more real, and, in the way that genuinely calm people can sometimes manage, slightly frightening. "Thank you, Daniel," she said. Her voice carried clearly across the room because the room was quiet, and she spoke with the steady tone of someone who had prepared for exactly this. "That's very kind of you." She paused, and in that pause, the room held its breath. "I do have some news," she said. "And since we're being honest tonight, I'm happy to share it." She touched her left hand briefly to the front of her dress, and anyone who had not noticed before now understood what they were looking at. "I'm 5 months pregnant, and I'm very happy about it." A sound moved through the room. Not quite a gasp, more like a collective intake of breath followed by a murmur that rippled from table to table. "The father is a wonderful man named Marcus," Sarah continued, her voice still even. "He's currently in Germany on a work contract. He's been incredibly supportive." She looked around the room for a moment, not at Daniel, but at the other faces, the ones that had been watching her all evening with those careful expressions. "I know there were some stories going around about why Daniel and I divorced. I've heard a few of them. I don't usually respond to those kinds of things, but since we're all here together, I'll just say simply, it takes 2 people to build a marriage and 2 people to end one. That's all." She turned her gaze back to Daniel. He had lowered his glass. His face was very still. "I wish you and Claire every happiness," Sarah said. "I mean that." She lifted her own glass. To the happy couple. Around the room, slowly, glasses lifted. And something had shifted. She could feel it. The current of the room had turned. People who had looked at her with pity or with that careful knowing expression were now looking at her differently. Patrice, Daniel's cousin, was looking at her with something close to open admiration. The colleague's wife at Sarah's table had tears forming at the corners of her eyes for reasons that probably had more to do with her own life than with anything in that room. Claire set down her glass and leaned forward and looked at Daniel with an expression Sarah could not fully read from across the room. It was not the wide-eyed, surprised look from before. It was more contained than that, more serious. Sarah had the distinct impression that Claire had not known about Daniel's plan for that toast. She had the impression that Claire was now doing the same mental arithmetic that Sarah herself had done many times in the years of their marriage, adding up small moments and arriving at a number that changed something. Sarah sat back down. She picked up her fork. She finished the last of her salad. Beside her, the colleague's wife leaned over and quietly said, "That was remarkable." Sarah shook her head and said it was nothing and meant it, because by that point the shaking in her hands had mostly stopped, and she could eat again, and that felt like enough of a victory for one evening. What she did not know yet, sitting at that side table in the vineyard reception hall with her sparkling water and her half-eaten salad, was that the evening was not finished. Not even close. Because 30 minutes later, while the first dances were beginning and the room had begun to settle back into something resembling a normal wedding reception, Claire got up from the head table and walked across the room and sat down in the empty chair beside Sarah. She folded her hands on the table the way people do when they are about to say something they have been thinking about for longer than the moment suggests. And Sarah looked at her, this woman she had only seen in photos and today at an altar, and felt something she had not expected to feel. Curiosity. Not wariness. Not defensiveness. Genuine, open curiosity about what Claire was about to say. "I need to ask you something," Claire said. Her voice was quiet and direct and carried none of the performance of the earlier speeches. "And I need you to be honest with me." Sarah set down her fork again. She looked at the bride, in her white dress and her carefully done hair with a few strands coming loose now from the dancing, and she recognized something in Claire's eyes that she knew from her own mirror. The expression of a woman who has begun to realize that the story she was given might not be the whole story. "Okay," Sarah said. "Ask me." Claire's question was simple. She asked it the way people ask things when they have been turning them over in their mind for a long time and have finally decided that not knowing is worse than the risk of finding out. She asked, "Did Daniel know you were pregnant before today?" Sarah looked at her for a moment. The music from the dance floor drifted toward them, something slow and warm, and couples were moving together in the soft gold light, and the whole scene had the dreamy quality of a wedding at the end of its best hours. It felt strange to be sitting in the middle of it, having this very specific and very serious conversation. "He found out a few weeks ago," Sarah said carefully. "Through mutual friends. I hadn't told him myself." Claire nodded slowly, as if that answer had confirmed something she had already suspected rather than surprised her. She looked down at the tablecloth for a moment, smoothing a small wrinkle with one finger, and then looked back up. "And the way he brought it up tonight, was that what you expected from him?" Sarah considered the question honestly. "I thought something might happen," she said. "I didn't know exactly what. But yes, I knew he hadn't invited me here just to be kind." Claire was quiet for several seconds. Around them, the reception continued its easy motion, oblivious to the two of them sitting at the side table having a conversation that was pulling threads from something much larger than one wedding night. "He told me you were cold," Claire said finally. "He told me that during your marriage you were emotionally distant and that you were the one who gave up on things." "I know," Sarah said. "He's been telling people that." "Is it true?" "No," Sarah said simply. Not with anger. Not with the defensive sharpness of someone trying to win an argument. Just plainly and directly. The way you say something that you have accepted as true for a long time and no longer need to perform. "I went to couples counseling for 2 months by myself because he stopped going and didn't tell me. I spent 6 years trying to reach someone who kept moving just far enough away that I couldn't quite get there. When I finally stopped trying, he called that giving up." She paused. "I understand why his version sounds the way it does. But it's not what happened." Claire absorbed this without flinching. That was the thing that struck Sarah most about her. She did not flinch. She asked hard questions, and she sat with the answers without making a show of how the answers affected her. Sarah found herself respecting that quality enormously, sitting there in a vineyard reception hall on a Saturday night, talking to a woman she had no reason to know and every complicated reason to feel strange about. "He did the same thing to me once," Claire said quietly. "Not the counseling, but the moving away. I thought it was something I was doing wrong. I spent almost a year trying to figure out what I needed to change." She looked at her hands. "It stopped when I stopped trying to figure it out." Sarah did not say anything. She understood exactly what Claire meant. She understood it in the particular way that two people sometimes understand each other when they have lived through different versions of the same experience, shaped by the same source. They sat together in silence for a moment, not an uncomfortable one. The kind that happens when there is nothing that needs to be added to what has already been said. The song changed on the dance floor to something brighter, and several people cheered, and the energy of the room lifted and swirled around them like weather. "Why did you come today?" Claire asked. "Really? Because I was tired of his version of things being the only one people heard," Sarah said. "And because I wanted to see if I still had any anger left about the divorce. I needed to know." She looked across the room to where Daniel was standing with a group of his friends, laughing at something, his glass raised. He was not looking in their direction. I don't, she said. I thought I might. But I don't. Claire followed her gaze. Her expression was something Sarah could not fully name. Not hatred. Not the collapse of a person whose wedding day has gone wrong. Something more complicated and quieter. The expression of someone who is thinking very carefully about the next chapter of their life. Are you going to be okay? Sarah asked, and then immediately felt strange about asking it, because it was an enormous question to ask the woman who had just married your ex-husband 3 hours ago. But Claire did not seem to find it strange. She looked at Sarah directly and said, I think so. I'm not sure what today means for everything yet, but I'm not someone who panics. I pay attention and then I decide. She paused. I'm good at deciding. Sarah believed her. Claire stood up from the chair and smoothed the front of her dress and looked down at Sarah with an expression that was almost warm. Almost something that, in a very different kind of story, might have grown into something like friendship. For what it's worth, she said, I'm sorry about the toast. I didn't know he was going to do that. I know you didn't, Sarah said. That was clear. Claire nodded once and walked back toward the head table, and the room closed around her as she moved through it. And within 30 seconds, she was smiling and accepting congratulations from a group of guests and looked every bit the composed bride she had been all evening. Sarah watched her go and thought, that woman is going to be all right. Whatever happens, she is going to be all right. Sarah left the reception 20 minutes later. She said quiet goodbyes to the few people she knew and did not seek out Daniel. She gathered her small bag from under her chair and walked through the vineyard in the early evening air, past the long rows of grapevines going dark at the edges as the sun dropped behind the hills. The sky was the pale orange and gray of an autumn dusk, and her shoes made small sounds on the gravel path. And somewhere behind her the music from the reception carried out into the open air, and then fell away as she walked further toward the parking lot. She sat in her car for a few minutes before starting it. She pressed both hands flat against the steering wheel and breathed. Then she pressed one hand against her belly, the way she had that morning in front of the bathroom mirror, and she felt the small, steady reality of her baby, who had been with her through the whole of this extraordinary day without knowing any of it. She thought about Marcus. She took out her phone and typed a message to him. Long day. Call me tomorrow when you wake up. He responded within 2 minutes with a simple, of course. Everything okay? And she typed back, yes. More than okay, actually. Which was the truth. She was surprised to find it was the truth. 3 weeks after the wedding, Greta called her in a state of breathless amazement and told her that the video had been posted. Someone at the reception, a young woman Sarah barely remembered meeting, had recorded part of the evening on her phone and posted a short clip online without names or faces clearly visible, just the audio of Daniel's toast, and then Sarah's response, with a caption that said something like, came to my ex's wedding and this happened. The clip spread in the particular way things spread online when they carry the specific energy of a moment where someone refused to be diminished in public. Thousands of people shared it. Comments poured in from strangers who had never met Sarah and never would, who had watched 23 seconds of her standing up in a vineyard and raising a glass of sparkling water and saying calmly, I do have some news. And since we're being honest tonight, I'm happy to share it. Sarah watched the clip once. She found it strange to see herself from the outside. The dark blue dress, the steady voice, the hand briefly touching the front of the fabric. She looked, she thought, like a person who had decided something. She watched it once, and then she closed the app and did not watch it again. She told her mother about the baby the following Sunday over a long phone call that lasted nearly 2 hours. Her mother cried, which Sarah had expected, and then laughed, which Sarah had hoped for, and then said with enormous feeling, come home for Christmas. I want to put my hands on that belly. Sarah said yes, she would. Marcus came home from Germany for 10 days in November, and they sat across from each other in her small kitchen and talked about everything carefully and honestly, the way two people do when they are building something and want to build it right. They talked about what they wanted and what scared them and what they were willing to try. They did not arrive at easy answers. They arrived at real ones, which take longer but hold better. Sarah's daughter was born the following February. She was small and loud and perfect in the exhausting way that new humans are perfect, and she arrived into a room where Sarah's mother was crying quietly in the corner, and Marcus was holding Sarah's hand so tightly that she felt the bones of her fingers pressed together, and it was the best pain she had ever felt. She named her Lena. It was not a name with a story attached to it, or a meaning she had overthought. It was simply the name that fit the face when she saw it for the first time, small and red and furious, and entirely her own. Daniel sent a card. It arrived a week after Lena was born, a simple white card with a brief handwritten note that said, "Congratulations. I hope she has your strength." Sarah read it at her kitchen table, while Lena slept in the next room, and Marcus washed dishes, and the apartment smelled like coffee and baby soap, and the particular quiet comfort of a life being built carefully and well. She set the card down and did not feel much of anything about it. That, she thought, was the truest sign that she had arrived somewhere new. She had walked into that vineyard carrying things she thought were still too heavy to put down. She had walked out lighter than she had been in years. Not because anything had been resolved or explained or fixed, but because she had stood in a room full of people who expected her to shrink, and she had not. She had stood up, and she had spoken, and she had meant every word. And then she had driven home through the autumn dark and called no one and needed nothing and sat with her own life for the first time in a long time and found it was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, exactly what she had always deserved.